Mara Jenkins sat on the creaky wooden porch of her modest cottage, the salty sea breeze tousling her chestnut hair as she clutched a crisp white envelope in her hands. The eviction notice stared back at her in bold black letters, cold and unforgiving. 12 years. 12 years of memories, laughter and quiet mornings spent sipping coffee while Max, her golden retriever, lazily watched the horizon. Since her husband, Tom, had passed away suddenly 2 years ago, Mara's life had shrunk to the size of this small house and the companionship of Max. The town knew her as the quiet woman who always greeted neighbors with a polite nod, but rarely ventured far beyond the familiar streets. She kept to herself, not out of pride, but because grief had taught her the weight of loneliness. Max padded up beside her, resting his head gently on her knee. His soft brown eyes looked up, full of unwavering loyalty. Mara reached down and scratched, behind his ears, feeling a faint spark of comfort amid the storm raging inside her. This dog was more than a pet. He was her lifeline, her constant when everything else slipped away. The eviction notice was a cruel twist. The landlord, Mr. Harlan, was known for his cold heart and sharp tongue. He owned several properties in town, and rumors whispered that he was trying to clear out long-term tenants to raise rents for new investors. Mara had tried to reason with him after he came knocking one afternoon demanding entry without notice, but he dismissed her calmly yet firmly. "You either leave or I start legal proceedings," he had said, eyes hard as stone. Mara had nodded, swallowing her pride, but inside a fire began to flicker. This was her home. Tom had built their life here. She wasn't going to let it slip away without a fight. But the challenge was daunting. Mara had no lawyer, no savings for legal fees, and only a handful of friends who could offer sympathy but little else. The thought of standing alone in a courtroom was terrifying, and yet, as she looked at Max, she realized she wasn't truly alone. Together they had weathered storms before. This was just another. That evening, Mara sat at her kitchen table, the eviction notice placed between stacks of bills and faded photographs. Max lay stretched across the floor, occasionally glancing up as if sensing the turmoil in her mind. Mara's fingers trembled slightly as she pulled out a small notebook and began writing down what she knew: dates of rent payments, conversations with the landlord, the day she refused him entry. Her handwriting was neat but shaky, a reflection of the mixture of fear and determination swirling inside her. "I'll fight this," she whispered aloud, her voice barely more than a breath. Max wagged his tail softly as if agreeing. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Mara lay awake, staring at the ceiling, picturing the cold courtroom and the unfamiliar faces she would have to face. Would the judge see her as just another tenant? Would the landlord's lawyer dismiss her as insignificant? The questions circled relentlessly, yet beneath the anxiety, a quiet strength grew. She remembered Tom's words from years ago, spoken during a difficult patch in their marriage. "You're stronger than you know, Mara. Never forget that." Max shifted closer, resting his head on her arm. Mara smiled through the tears she hadn't realized were falling. She wasn't just fighting for a roof over her head. She was fighting for her dignity, for the memory of a life she wanted to protect. Morning came with a pale light, and Mara rose early. She dressed carefully in her best clothes, modest but clean, and clipped Max's leash to his collar. As they stepped outside, the familiar sights of the town came into focus. The bakery's warm glow, the children heading to school, neighbors, bustling about their routines. For the first time since the eviction notice arrived, Mara felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead would be hard and uncertain, but she would walk it step by step, with Max faithfully by her side. The fight had begun. Mara Jenkins felt the weight of the world pressing down on her as she stepped into the narrow hallway of the town's courthouse. The scent of polished wood and stale paper filled the air, mingling with faint murmurs of voices from nearby rooms. Max walked faithfully at her side, his leash loosely held in her hand, his steady presence a quiet comfort in the sea of strangers. The eviction notice had come like a thunderbolt, and now she stood on the front lines of a battle she barely understood. The landlord, Mr. Harlan, was no ordinary man. He owned nearly half the rental properties in town, and was known for pushing tenants out on a whim to raise rents or sell to developers. Mara had heard stories whispered in the market and at the post office, stories of people beaten down by the system, their voices drowned out by money and power. She thought about her own position, just a single woman with no legal training and no money for an attorney. The thought made her chest tighten, but giving up wasn't an option. She had a home, a lifetime of memories, and Max. As Mara sat in the crowded waiting room, she noticed the difference between herself and the others. Most were sharp-suited, carrying thick folders, confident and prepared. She clutched a small, worn notebook filled with scribbled notes and receipts. She was out of her league, but she had something they didn't: raw determination. A few people glanced at Max with curiosity or mild disapproval. Dogs weren't common in courtrooms. Mara caught a sympathetic smile from a middle-aged woman sitting across from her, but for the most part she felt invisible, an outsider fighting an invisible enemy. When her name was called, Mara's heart jumped. The courtroom was larger than she imagined, with high ceilings, heavy wooden benches, and a judge's bench that seemed to loom like a throne. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, Max sitting quietly by her side as the bailiff motioned for her to stand before the judge. Across the room, Mr. Harlan sat with his lawyer, an imposing man in a dark suit with a sharp jaw and cold eyes. Mara felt a chill as their gaze met. The landlord barely acknowledged her, his expression unreadable. The judge, a tall man with silver hair and a stern look, softened by kind eyes, peered over his glasses. "Miss Jenkins, I understand you are representing yourself?" Mara nodded, her voice steady despite the tremor inside. "Yes, Your Honor. Do you have counsel?" "No, sir." The judge's eyes flicked briefly to Max. "And the dog?" "This is Max. He helps me with my anxiety," Mara explained quietly. There was a moment of silence. The judge gave a small nod. "Very well. Let's proceed." As the landlord's lawyer began, Mara listened closely. He spoke with practiced ease, laying out the landlord's claim: unpaid rent, lease violations, and a firm request for eviction. Mara's stomach churned. She knew none of it was true. When it was her turn, she took a breath, the courtroom watching with mild curiosity. "Your Honor, I have always paid my rent on time. I have records to prove it," she said, pulling out her folder and carefully handing over copies of receipts and bank statements. She spoke of the landlord's harassment, the times he entered without notice, and the day he threatened her with eviction after she refused access. Each word was weighted with quiet pain but spoken with growing confidence. Max sat calmly beside her, his eyes fixed on her as if understanding the gravity of the moment. The landlord's lawyer scoffed, trying to undermine her credibility. "A tenant with no legal representation and a dog. This is hardly a serious defense." Mara's cheeks flushed, but she didn't back down. "I'm not just a tenant. I'm someone who deserves fairness." Throughout the hearing, Mara caught glimpses of the judge watching her closely. He didn't interrupt, but took notes, his gaze sometimes softening when Max moved or when Mara's voice wavered. Outside the courtroom, whispers spread quickly. A woman standing nearby told a colleague, "She's brave, going up against that man alone." Mara left the courthouse that day feeling drained but strangely hopeful. The fight was far from over, but the first step had been taken. As she walked home with Max trailing happily, Mara whispered to him, "We're in this together, boy, no matter what," and Max's tail wagged as if to say, "Always." The sun had long dipped below the horizon when Mara Jenkins finally closed the front door of her modest cottage behind her. The world outside was dark and still, but inside, Mara's small kitchen was alive with the soft rustling of pages and the warm glow of a single lamp. Max curled up at her feet, his breathing steady and calm, a steady anchor in the sea of uncertainty that surrounded her. The eviction notice weighed heavily on Mara's mind, but so did something else, the gnawing fear that she didn't know enough to fight back. The courthouse had been intimidating, the landlord's lawyer sharp and condescending. Yet somewhere deep inside, Mara felt a spark of defiance. She was determined to understand the rules of the game and play by them, no matter how steep the learning curve. For hours, Mara pored over books and pamphlets from the local library, guides about tenant rights, eviction procedures, and small claims court. The legal language was dense and confusing, but she reread every sentence until it began to make sense. She scribbled notes and underlined important sections, her hand growing tired but her resolve only strengthening. Max shifted beside her, sensing her frustration during moments when she slammed a book shut or muttered in confusion. But his presence was a comfort. Whenever Mara's shoulders drooped or her eyes stung with fatigue, Max nudged her hand with his wet nose or rested his head on her knee, reminding her she wasn't alone. Some nights, she rehearsed her testimony out loud, speaking softly as Max listened intently. "I've lived here for 12 years. I've always paid my rent on time. The landlord has no right to evict me without cause." The words felt foreign coming from her lips, but each repetition built her courage. One evening, after a particularly long study session, Mara sat back and closed her eyes. Her mind wandered to Tom, his warm smile, the way he'd always told her to stand tall and never be afraid to ask for help. The memories were bittersweet, but they steeled her. She wasn't just fighting for a roof over her head anymore. She was fighting for the life she and Tom had built, and for the future she still hoped to have. The small town around her was bustling with everyday life, yet Mara felt isolated in her battle. Few people knew what she faced. Some friends had offered kind words, but no one had stepped forward to help with legal advice or moral support. It was as if she was invisible, a shadow in a community that moved on without noticing her struggle. Still, Mara refused to let loneliness become despair. Instead, she found strength in small moments. The way Max wagged his tail when she spoke with confidence, the friendly nod of the librarian who handed her more resources, the quiet satisfaction of organizing her paperwork neatly in a folder. 1. Afternoon, Mara visited the courthouse again, this time to watch other cases and get a feel for how the proceedings worked. She sat in the gallery, observing how judges listened, how lawyers argued, and how people like her spoke up for themselves. The experience was both intimidating and empowering. Max lay at her feet, calm as ever, drawing curious glances from other visitors. Mara noticed that the presence of her dog seemed to soften the atmosphere around her, a small comforting force in a place often filled with tension. Back at home, Mara created a checklist: dates to remember, documents to gather, questions to prepare. Each task completed was a small victory. She even began practicing deep breathing exercises, learning how to manage the anxiety that threatened to overwhelm her. Despite the progress, Mara's confidence was fragile. Some days, doubts crept in like shadows. Could she really win? Was she foolish to think she could stand up to a powerful landlord alone? But then she looked at Max, loyal, patient, unwavering, and found the courage to push forward. "You and me, Max," she whispered one chilly night, her voice steady but full of hope. "We'll get through this together." And Max, as if understanding every word, nuzzled her hand in quiet agreement. The fight was far from over. But Mara was no longer just a frightened woman facing eviction. She was a woman quietly gathering strength, one page, one breath, one loyal paw at a time. The morning sun had barely risen when Mara Jenkins stood outside the courthouse doors, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and resolve. Clutching Max's leash tightly in one hand and a folder filled with carefully organized papers in the other, she took a deep breath. Today was the day she had dreaded and prepared for, the day she would face the courtroom alone. The courthouse was an imposing building, with towering stone pillars and heavy wooden doors that seemed to swallow her up as she stepped inside. The marble floors echoed with the footsteps of lawyers, clerks, and citizens, their voices a low murmur of busy activity. Mara's stomach fluttered with nerves as she scanned the crowd, Max faithfully walking beside her, his golden fur shining in the soft light. Before she could reach the security checkpoint, a tall bailiff stepped forward, blocking her path. His expression was firm but not unkind. "Ma'am, dogs aren't allowed in the courthouse," he said, eyeing Max suspiciously. Mara's heart sank. She tightened her grip on Max's leash and looked up at the officer, her voice steady despite the fear twisting in her chest. "Max helps me manage my anxiety. I can't come without him." The bailiff hesitated, glancing around as if expecting someone to intervene. But the courthouse lobby was busy, and no one stepped forward. Mara felt the weight of countless eyes on her, some curious, some doubtful. Just then, a voice called from inside the courtroom. "Bring her in." It was the judge. The bailiff's expression softened as he nodded and opened the door for her. Mara's heart skipped a beat. Inside, the courtroom was filled with people, lawyers whispering, spectators shifting in their seats, the landlord sitting confidently at his table, and at the center the judge, a tall man with silver hair and a reputation for being strict but fair. The judge's eyes met Mara's as she stepped inside with Max by her side. A faint smile touched his lips, breaking the serious atmosphere. "Ms. Jenkins, I understand you have brought your dog with you." "Yes, Your Honor," Mara replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Max helps me stay calm." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "Very well. Max may stay." A ripple of surprise passed through the courtroom. Whispers filled the air. Some people glanced at Mara and Max. Others looked at the judge as if he had just made an unexpected decision. Mara felt a rush of gratitude and relief. Max settled calmly beside her, his tail wagging gently, sensing the shift in the room's energy. As the hearing began, the landlord's lawyer launched into a confident opening statement, outlining the eviction case with practiced ease. Mara listened, taking mental notes, her nerves steadied by the judge's calm presence and Max's quiet companionship. When it was her turn, Mara stood and spoke clearly, her voice firmer than she expected. She presented her evidence, the rent receipts, photographs of the property, records of the landlord's unannounced visits. She told her story, not just as a tenant, but as a person fighting to keep her home. Max stayed close, occasionally looking up at her as if to say, "You've got this." Throughout the proceedings, the judge watched Mara intently, occasionally exchanging a glance with Max, who lay quietly by her feet. His presence seemed to soften even the sternest faces in the poor room. By the time the hearing ended, Mara felt a quiet confidence she hadn't known she possessed. The courtroom buzzed with a new energy, not just because of the unusual sight of a woman with her dog standing up to a powerful landlord, but because something had shifted. As she left the courtroom, neighbors and strangers alike offered nods of respect. Mara held Max's leash a little tighter, feeling a bond between them stronger than ever. Outside, the world seemed a little less daunting. The fight wasn't over, but today she had made a statement, one of courage, dignity, and the unbreakable bond between a woman and her dog. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as Mara Jenkins stepped forward, her heart pounding but her voice surprisingly steady. The weight of the moment pressed on her, but Max at her feet was a silent reminder of the strength she carried. She wasn't just fighting for a roof over her head. This was about justice, dignity, and standing tall when the odds felt impossible. The landlord's lawyer wasted no time. His voice was sharp and calculated as he laid out the accusations. Late rent payments, alleged lease violations, and a firm demand for eviction. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had won countless battles before, confident that Mara's lack of legal representation would seal her fate. Mara listened carefully, letting his words settle in the room like cold stones. When it was her turn, she unfolded her notes and took a deep breath. "Your Honor," she began, "I've lived in this home for 12 years. Every rent payment has been made on time, without fail. I have records to prove it." She handed over the neatly organized receipts and bank statements. The judge took them, flipping through pages with a thoughtful expression. The landlord's lawyer scoffed from his seat, trying to undermine her credibility. "Ms. Jenkins is clearly unprepared to defend herself. This is a waste of the court's time." Mara met his gaze steadily. "I may not be a lawyer, but I know what's right. I've faced threats and intimidation. I've tried to keep my home, the home I shared with my late husband. This fight is about more than money." Her voice grew stronger, fueled by months of sleepless nights and quiet courage. She told the courtroom about the landlord's sudden demands, his unannounced visits that left her feeling vulnerable and unsafe. She spoke of the eviction notice that threatened to uproot her entire life, and how Max had been her constant support through the darkest days. Max remained calm at her feet, his golden eyes watching her with unwavering loyalty. At one point, he shifted and looked up at the judge, drawing a faint smile from the usually stern man on the bench. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Jenkins, can you explain how Max helps you during these difficult times?" Mara nodded, her voice softening. "Max is more than a pet. He helps me manage my anxiety. When I feel overwhelmed, his presence calms me. He gives me the strength to face things I never thought I could." The courtroom was silent, the usual tension giving way to a sense of empathy. Mara's words seemed to bridge the gap between cold, legal arguments and the human story behind the case. The landlord's lawyer attempted to redirect the focus. "This is a legal matter, Your Honor. Emotional appeals don't change the facts." But Mara's story had already touched something deeper. The judge's eyes lingered on her, thoughtful and measured. As the hearing progressed, witnesses were called. Neighbors who had quietly supported Mara over the years stepped forward to speak about her reliability and kindness. The landlord's reputation for aggressive tactics was laid bare through testimony that painted a more complicated picture than the polished arguments of his lawyer. Mara sat back, exhaustion creeping in, but also a quiet hope. This wasn't just about legal documents. It was about standing up when others tried to push her down. Throughout it all, Max was a steady presence, his calm demeanor offering Mara a sense of peace in the chaos. When she glanced down at him, his tail gave a small, reassuring wag. By the time the court adjourned for the day, Mara felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation. The fight was far from over, but she had made her voice heard. Outside the courthouse, a few people approached her with words of encouragement. A neighbor she barely knew said, "You're braver than anyone I know." Mara smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. For the first time in months, she felt she wasn't invisible anymore. As she walked away, Max trotting happily beside her, Mara knew this was more than just a legal battle. It was a turning point in her life. No matter what the verdict, she had proven something important. She was not alone, and she was not defeated. The days after the courtroom hearing blurred together for Mara Jenkins, filled with a restless kind of waiting. Each morning she woke early, Max curled beside her, ready to face whatever challenges the day might bring. Her mind constantly replayed moments from the trial, the judge's thoughtful gaze, the landlord's cold stare, and the small, unexpected nods of support she had glimpsed from strangers. Though she was alone in many ways, Mara had started to notice something new, the quiet kindness of people she had barely known. Mrs. Carter from the grocery store offered extra bags without charge. Mr. Lewis, the postman, lingered a little longer during his deliveries, asking if she needed help with anything. Even her neighbor across the street, a woman named Ellen who usually kept to herself, brought over a warm pie one afternoon and sat with Mara on the porch, sharing stories of her own struggles. At first, Mara had been reluctant to accept help. Pride and the instinct to face her fight alone had kept her guarded. But with each small act of kindness, she realized she didn't have to be a solitary warrior. The community was there, quietly watching, quietly caring. One chilly afternoon, as Mara sat on the porch reviewing her notes, a knock came at the door. She opened it to find a man in his early 40s, wearing a worn jacket and a gentle smile. "Ms. Jenkins, my name's Daniel. I heard about your case from a friend in town." Mara blinked, surprised. "I don't think we've met." Daniel nodded. "That's because I usually keep to myself, but I'm a lawyer and I want to help. Pro bono." The offer caught Mara off guard. She looked down at Max, who wagged his tail as if sensing the shift. Could this be the break she needed? Over the next few days, Daniel came by regularly. He pored over the paperwork Mara had gathered, helped her understand legal jargon, and coached her on how to present her case more effectively. His calm presence was a balm to Mara's frayed nerves. "I've seen cases like yours before," Daniel said one afternoon as Max lay at their feet. "Sometimes landlords try to bully tenants into leaving, but there are laws to protect you. We just need to make sure your voice is heard clearly." With Daniel's help, Mara refined her arguments and prepared for the next court date. She practiced answering questions, organizing evidence, and telling her story in a way that was both clear and compelling. Meanwhile, Max remained a constant source of strength. Daniel even remarked once, "That dog of yours is a miracle worker." As the day of the next hearing approached, Mara felt a mix of nerves and determination. She wasn't alone anymore. She had an ally, a plan, and the support of a community that was beginning to rally around her. On the morning of the hearing, Mara stood outside the courthouse with Daniel by her side and Max sitting obediently. The judge greeted them warmly, remembering Mara from the previous session. When the landlord's lawyer appeared, Mara noticed a flicker of hesitation in his confident demeanor. The tide was shifting. Inside the courtroom, Mara's new attorney spoke with clarity and authority, presenting evidence and countering the landlord's claims. Mara added her personal testimony, now stronger and more focused. Max's calm presence continued to soften the atmosphere, reminding everyone that this case was about more than contracts and payments. It was about a person's home and dignity. By the end of the day, the judge announced he would take the case under advisement, promising a fair and careful review. As Mara left the courthouse, she felt a surge of hope. The fight wasn't over, but she was no longer fighting alone. With Daniel's help and Max's loyalty, she had found unseen allies and unexpected support. And in that support, Mara discovered a courage she hadn't known she possessed. The day of the verdict arrived with a crispness in the air that seemed to amplify every sound. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the rustle of papers in the courthouse, the soft whispers of anticipation among the gathered crowd. Mara Jenkins stood just outside the courtroom doors, Max at her side, his steady presence anchoring her swirling thoughts. She had rehearsed this moment countless times, but nothing could truly prepare her for the raw emotion bubbling beneath the surface. Would justice prevail? Would she be allowed to keep the home she had fought so fiercely to protect? Inside, the courtroom was packed with familiar faces, neighbors, strangers, even some of the court staff who had followed her case with quiet interest. The judge entered, his steps measured, his expression unreadable. The room fell into a hush. Mara's eyes locked with his as he took his seat, the gavel resting silently before him. The landlord's lawyer sat stiffly, his confidence noticeably diminished since the first hearing. Mara, clutching the folder that contained her evidence, felt Max's calm energy beside her, reminding her to breathe. "Ms. Jenkins," the judge began, his voice steady and clear, "after careful review of the evidence, testimonies and circumstances surrounding this case, the court has reached a decision." Mara held her breath, the weight of years, months and weeks of struggle pressing down on her. "The landlord's claims of unpaid rent and lease violations are unsubstantiated," the judge continued. "Moreover, the landlord's repeated unannounced entries and intimidation tactics constitute a breach of tenant rights." A soft murmur rippled through the courtroom. Mara felt a flicker of hope spark inside her. "Therefore," the judge declared, "the eviction notice is hereby dismissed, and Ms. Jenkins is allowed to remain in her home." The room erupted quietly. Some clapped softly, others exchanged looks of relief. Mara's eyes filled with tears. She hadn't realized she was holding back. She looked down at Max, who tilted his head and wagged his tail, as if sharing in the victory. Her voice trembling, Mara whispered, "Thank you, Max, we did it." The landlord's lawyer rose, his face tight with frustration, but the judge cut him off firmly. "This court values the rights of all citizens. It is not a place for intimidation or bullying." As the courtroom began to clear, Mara found herself surrounded by neighbors and strangers alike. Mrs. Carter from the grocery store smiled warmly. "You stood your ground, Mara. You showed us all what it means to be strong." Ellen, her neighbor, hugged her tightly. "I'm so proud of you. You never gave up." Mara's heart swelled with gratitude. For the first time in months, she felt seen, respected, and supported. Later, as she walked home with Max, the autumn breeze carrying the scent of fallen leaves and new beginnings, Mara reflected on the journey that had brought her here. It had started with fear and uncertainty, but through quiet courage, the loyalty of a dog and unexpected allies, she had reclaimed more than just her home. She had reclaimed her voice and her dignity. Max trotted happily beside her, and Mara smiled, knowing their bond had been the true foundation of her strength. The fight had been hard, the road long, but today was a reminder that justice, though sometimes slow, could still be found, and with Max by her side, Mara was ready for whatever came next. The courtroom battle was over, but Mara Jenkins knew her journey was far from finished. Standing on the porch of her little cottage, Max beside her, she felt a profound sense of relief wash over her. The eviction notice was dismissed, her home was safe, and her dignity restored. Yet the true victory was something deeper, a renewed faith in herself and the kindness of others. The community around Mara had quietly rallied, offering help in ways she hadn't expected. Ellen stopped by regularly to share meals and stories, creating a warmth Mara hadn't realized she'd been missing. Mrs. Carter brought fresh vegetables from her garden. The librarian handed her books on home repair and local resources, encouraging her to rebuild not just her life, but her confidence. Mara began to see her cottage not just as a shelter, but as a place of possibility. She made plans to fix the creaky porch steps, repaint the weathered walls, and plant flowers along the walkway. Each small task was a step forward, a tangible reminder that she was reclaiming her life, piece by piece. Max remained her constant companion, his presence a daily reminder of loyalty and unconditional love. Together they ventured beyond the confines of her home, exploring nearby parks and trails where Mara found peace in the simple beauty of nature. One afternoon, Daniel, her lawyer and newfound friend, stopped by with a smile. "How are you feeling?" "Stronger," Mara replied, her eyes bright. "I never thought I could get through this, but with everyone's help and Max, I'm ready to face whatever comes next." Daniel nodded. "You've shown incredible strength, and remember, you're not alone anymore. You have people who care." Mara realized that was the most important lesson of all. The fight for her home had revealed a hidden network of kindness and support, reminding her that even in the darkest moments, hope could be found. She thought about Tom, her late husband, and how proud he would be. The home they built together was safe. But more than that, Mara had built something new, a community, a support system, and a future. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink, Mara sat on her porch with Max nestled beside her. The quiet sounds of the neighborhood filled the air, children playing, neighbors chatting, the distant hum of life going on. For the first time in a long time, Mara felt peace. She whispered to Max, "We did it. We're home." Max looked up at her with gentle eyes as if to say, "Yes, and this is just the beginning." The fight had tested Mara's courage, resilience, and heart. It had pushed her to the edge and back, but it also taught her the power of standing up, of asking for help, and of never losing hope. Her story, the woman who entered the court with just her dog, was no longer just about eviction or legal battles. It was about the strength found in unlikely friendships, the quiet courage in facing fears, and the unbreakable bond between a woman and her loyal companion. And as Mara looked out at the night sky, stars twinkling above, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would meet them head-on, with Max by her side and a heart full of hope.